The Galactic Naval Academy's combat theory classroom fell silent as Cadet Sarah Chen walked through the door. At barely 5 feet tall, with her dark hair pulled back in regulation style, she looked unremarkable by human standards. To her alien classmates, however, she was a walking nightmare wrapped in a standard-issue uniform. Professor Xylac, a towering Vorthon with crystalline skin that shimmered in the classroom's artificial light, gestured toward an empty seat in the middle of the room. "Cadet Chen, please take your assigned position. Today we'll be discussing theoretical engagement scenarios between various species." Sarah nodded respectfully and made her way through the rows of desks. The other cadets, mostly Cathara with their elegant four-armed frames, several bulky Gornathi, and a handful of wispy ethereals, shifted uncomfortably as she passed. Whispers followed in her wake, spoken in a dozen different languages, but all carrying the same undertone of unease. "Deathworlder," someone hissed in Catharan. "Savage," muttered another in Gornathi. Sarah kept her expression neutral as she settled into her seat. 3 months at the academy had taught her that reacting to the slurs only made things worse. Earth's recent admission to the Galactic Confederation had come with conditions. Humans could attend the academy, but they were watched constantly, evaluated for signs of the primitive aggression that their homeworld supposedly bred into them. The irony wasn't lost on her. Earth was classified as a Class 12 death world, one of the most hostile environments in known space. Yet here she was, trying to prove that humans could be civilized enough to serve alongside species that had never known real predation, never felt the bite of natural selection that had forged humanity in fire and blood. Professor Xylac began his lecture on defensive formations, his voice a melodious chime that the universal translator converted into crisp standard. Sarah took notes diligently, her enhanced reflexes allowing her to write faster than most of her classmates could think. It was another reminder of the biological gifts, or curses, depending on perspective, that evolution had granted her species. 20 minutes into the class, Cadet Thys raised one of his forearms. The Cathara's voice carried the typical musical quality of his species as he spoke. "Professor, I have a question about practical application." "Of course, Cadet Thys." Thys's black eyes fixed on Sarah. "How can we trust defensive formations when serving alongside species that are inherently unpredictable? Surely Deathworlders lack the discipline for coordinated tactics." A ripple of agreement passed through the classroom. Sarah felt her jaw tighten but kept her eyes on her notes. Professor Xylac's crystalline features shifted in what might have been discomfort. "All species bring unique capabilities to the Confederation Navy," the professor replied diplomatically. "Diversity of thought and biology strengthens our—" "With respect, Professor," interrupted Cadet Morks, a massive Gornathi whose rocky hide made him look like a walking boulder. "Some of us have concerns about training alongside primitives. What happens when their savage instincts take over?" The classroom erupted in supporting murmurs. Sarah's pencil snapped in her grip. "Perhaps," Thys continued, standing from his seat, "we should test these instincts, for educational purposes, of course." Sarah looked up to find Thys approaching her desk, flanked by Morks and 2 other cadets, a second Gornathi named Brick and a Cathara female called Civics. Professor Xylac seemed frozen, his species' natural conflict aversion paralyzing him in the face of the brewing confrontation. "Stand up, Deathworlder," Thys commanded, his musical voice taking on a harsh edge. "Show us how humans defend themselves." Sarah remained seated. "I'm not looking for trouble, Thys." "Of course not. Violence is all your kind understands." Thys reached out with one of his lower arms and swept Sarah's notes to the floor. "I said stand up." The classroom held its collective breath. Sarah slowly rose from her chair, her movements fluid and controlled. At her full height, she barely reached This's chest, and Morks towered over both of them like a mountain. 4 against 1 seems about right for your species, Sarah said quietly. Very civilized. Morks laughed, a sound like grinding stone. 4? This isn't a fight, human. This is a demonstration. What happened next would be analyzed in Academy security footage for years to come, broken down frame by frame to understand how a single human cadet had moved so impossibly fast. This reached for Sarah's shoulder with 2 arms simultaneously. She ducked under the first, caught the second at the wrist, and used the Cathera's own momentum to spin him into Morks. The impact sent both aliens stumbling backward into a desk. Civix lunged from Sarah's left, her forearms spread wide to grapple. Sarah sidestepped, grabbed the back of Civix's neck, and introduced her face to the nearest desk surface with a precise application of force that left the Cathara conscious but thoroughly dazed. Brick, the second Gornathi, charged like the living. Boulder he resembled. Sarah dropped low, swept his legs with a move that would have been impossible for any species that hadn't evolved from persistence hunters, and used his falling momentum to guide him face first into the wall. By the time Thys and Morks had untangled themselves, Sarah was back in her original position, hands loose at her sides, breathing steady. The entire engagement had lasted 12 seconds. Security to Classroom 7 Delta, Professor Xylac finally managed to say into his communicator, his voice shaking. Medical teams required. Sarah looked around the silent classroom, meeting the wide-eyed stares of her classmates. 4 cadets lay groaning on the floor or slumped against furniture, none seriously injured, but all requiring medical attention for bruises, minor concussions, and wounded pride. For the record, Sarah said, calmly straightening her uniform, humans don't start fights. We finish them. She gathered her scattered notes from the floor and returned to her seat as the first security personnel burst through the door. As the medics tended to the 4 injured cadets, Sarah caught Professor Xylac's eye. Professor, she said respectfully, I believe you were discussing defensive formations. I'd like to hear more about coordinated tactics. The Vorthon stared at her for a long moment before his crystalline features shifted into what might have been the beginning of a smile. Indeed, Cadet Chen. Perhaps you could share some insights on rapid response techniques? As the injured cadets were carried out on stretchers, Sarah noticed the change in how her remaining classmates looked at her. The whispers continued, but now they carried a different tone entirely. Fear, yes, but also something else. Respect. Word of the incident spread through the academy like wildfire. Within hours, the story had grown in the telling. The human cadet who had taken on 6 attackers, who had moved like lightning, who had shown the controlled violence that made Deathworlders so terrifying to contemplate. But Sarah knew the truth, was simpler and more complex than the legends already forming around her. She hadn't fought like a savage or a primitive. She had fought like a human, with precision, efficiency, and the cold calculation of a species that had clawed its way to the top of the food chain on a world that actively tried to kill everything that lived on it. That evening, as she sat in her quarters writing her incident report, Sarah reflected on the day's events. The Academy had wanted to see what humans were capable of when pushed. Now they knew. The question was, what would they do with that knowledge?